So what we have are schools that were literally designed to provide the workforce for an industrial age economy.
It takes a long life of learning, reading, travel, experience to become an educated person.
This is a phenomenal time to be a curious person.
The illiterate of the 21st century won't be those who can't read and write, but those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. What do you want? And why do you want what you want? Most people are pretty good at answering the first question, but terrible at answering the second. Why is this? Well, most of us think that what we want comes from the inside, when very often the behaviors that we display, the desires that we have, they come from the outside, from the people around us, from the models that we see in media, and all the other different sources that we're influenced by. This idea of mimetic desire is incredibly powerful. It's behind the reason why very often we end up liking the same music as our friends or choosing the same career path as the people we go to school with. It influences the romantic partners that we choose, the clothes we wear, and where we go on holiday. Once you tap into this very simple idea, you start to see how powerful it is and how it drives so much of what goes on in the world. Luke Burgess is the perfect person to help you understand this idea. He's just published the book Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire and How to Want What You Need. And in it, he draws on his experience as an entrepreneur, a teacher, and a student of classical philosophy to get into the mechanics, the systems, the processes, the influences that basically determine what we want and how we end up acting on those desires. It's the foundation for today's conversation. And we go in all sorts of different directions, covering a whole bunch of interesting topics. We talk about the way to turn blind, unintentional wanting that leaves you unfulfilled into desires that are actually based on your own values. We talk about the power of role models and how we're influenced by celebrities, friends, family, co-workers, neighbors, and the ways that we can inoculate ourselves against wanting things that we don't want. We also talk about how conflict is often based on similarities, not differences, and how to break the cycle both in our personal lives and in society as a whole. We also tap into some of Luke's personal stories, including the failed sale of his company to Zappos, which led him to reevaluate what he wanted in life, his friendship with Zappos CEO Tony Hsieh, who's since passed, and the foundational ideas of the philosopher René Girard, who coined the term mimetic desire. This was a brilliant conversation, and I think once you tap into this idea of mimetic desire, you will see how profound it is. I certainly did by reading the book and having the conversation with Luke. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here's my conversation with Luke Burgess. Luke, welcome to the show.
Hey, Nasos, it's good to be with you.
It's great to have you on. I'm looking forward to getting stuck into this book, which definitely brought up a lot of interesting thoughts, reflections, questions on my side about what do I want and how do I want the things that I want? And we'll get into that. I'd love to start off with your journey with wanting and getting familiar with what it is that you want to do. I mean, let's go right back to school. What was school like for you? And do you remember first wanting to do something at school, be it in sports, be it in academics, be it in something? Just kind of walk me through your experience and relationship to wanting back in the early days.
My high school was rough. I went to high school in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it was just a rough go for me. I didn't really find my place. I got kicked out of one school for getting into a little scuffle and transferred to another one for my final 2 years. I didn't really have a good vision for my life. I didn't really know what I wanted to do after high school, if I wanted to go to university. I mean, I knew that I wanted to go to college, but I just wasn't quite sure what path I was going to take. I wanted to be a doctor, even though I didn't have great grades in high school. I still wanted to be a doctor, and part of the reason I wanted to be a doctor is because I love the show ER, and I watched George Clooney on that show. I sort of grew up when it was at its peak. I was in middle school and high school, and I just thought, like, well, being a doctor looks really cool and sexy and all those things. And I didn't know, like, how much time you have to put in and how much money it costs and how rough it can actually be. So I applied to, like, all the medical schools I could find in New York City specifically, because I was just felt like I wanted to get out of Michigan and get out of the Midwest, and it's probably because I had some models of what of desire in New York. So I wanted to kind of differentiate myself from my upbringing and get to the city, kind of like if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere kind of mentality. I didn't get into any medical schools. But that was like a blessing in disguise, quite frankly, because I that would have not been a good path for me. I would have gotten there and I would have realized pretty quickly that it wasn't the path. So I went to a small little school in downtown Manhattan called Pace University. It's one of the only schools that accepted me. And they had like the best business school. That was what they're known for. So I said, I'll just start here and see what happens, right? Can't be a bad thing to learn some basic business skills. I can always change my major later. So that's the path that I took. And once I got there, I realized that a lot of people at Pace wanted certain kinds of jobs, and those jobs were typically in Wall Street and investment banking, and that those jobs were extremely hard to get, and that I would have maybe a better chance of getting them if I transferred to another school. So I transferred to NYU after my sophomore year, and I just, I didn't realize until years later, but I was definitely on a hypermimetic track. Sorry to use words we haven't talked about yet, but I was being heavily influenced by the people around me, my classmates. It's not that I didn't enjoy business or didn't enjoy learning about finance, but I also deeply enjoyed literature and the humanities. So like the classes that I liked the most at university were philosophy and all of my literature classes. And I should have paid attention to that, but I sort of didn't. I was like, well, that's weird. Like none of my other classmates like those. I hate those classes. I like them the best. So I sort of, I follow the track, and one of the problems with being, I was pretty good at crunching numbers, and I'm hyper competitive, and you have to be both of those things to do well at that school and to get a job on Wall Street. And the problem with that is like sometimes like just because you're good at something doesn't mean you should do it. So I sort of, I took my success in kind of fighting my way to the top of the internship, heap and getting the jobs as some sign that this is what I was meant to do. And I didn't realize until, well, it didn't take me very long. I didn't realize until 6 or 7 months into it that I was pretty miserable and that I wanted to pivot and take a different track.
And you were talking about sort of like being influenced by your peers and what everyone else was doing, and that reading your background and hearing you talk about it just then as well kind of takes me back to my university days as well. I was exactly the same. Like, so I did economics at university, but it was a toss-up between economics and languages, which I really liked. But I was like, well, I'm not really going to get a job with this, and what's everyone else doing? And I'm probably going to end up being an investment banker. Went off and did internships in banking, ended up hating it. But do you remember the first sort of time of being, was it this sort of the pain or the struggle of being in that environment and realizing that this wasn't the right fit for you that got you to sort of detach from that? And did that feel like the first time over the course of your life that you'd actually properly removed yourself and taken a step back from it? Or were there other moments throughout your teens and kind of growing up where you were like, oh, hang on a second, maybe I don't want what the group wants?
I don't know if there was one particular moment that I could look at. I think there was a series of moments along the way. The most powerful moment is the one that came years later, and it's the one that I describe in the book. That was the one that was kind of the final wake-up call for me. But that didn't come until my later 20s. There were moments in my journey where I had a nagging sense that something was off. So when I left investment banking, I moved to California and started my first company. And when I did that, I knew that I was doing something that was a step in the right direction. I knew that I was detaching myself from at least the finance track that I knew was not for me. But even when I got to California and I was in the startup world, similar forces were at work, right? Very similar forces were at work. So I found myself like leaving one stream just to like enter another one. And in some ways, the forces in that stream were, just as strong, if not stronger. So, I realized like there's a universal thing here that may not be native to like any particular industry. There's like some kind of a universal force that I couldn't put my finger on, but I think I got like little hints along the way that something was going on, and I made progress until I finally had kind of a breakthrough, and that was associated with my learning of Girard.
Yeah, we'll get into that moment as well that I think you opened the book with in terms of the startup situation. Just before we do, you've mentioned the word, mimetic, hypermimetic already. It's at the core of the book and a lot of the things we're talking about. Let's just dive into that super quick. What are you talking about when you talk about something is mimetic or the process of mimesis? Can you just explain that quickly for listeners?
Yeah, mimesis is a word that just simply means imitation, coined by the French thinker René Girard. And we know that humans are mimetic. This is an observation that Aristotle made, that Plato made, that humans are imitative. We imitate art. It's how art is made. It's how we learn languages. It's responsible for the formation of culture. So we're the most imitative creatures in the world. So mimetic desire is Girard's key insight, and it means that we not only imitate language and facial expressions and cultural norms, but that we even imitate the desires of others. So we're constantly being shaped by what other people want, often while imagining our desires as being completely our own and completely autonomously sort of generated, like a product of myself. But so his insight was that the self is actually a product of relationships, and we're social creatures. So to say that these environments were mimetic, or that I was highly mimetic, simply means that I was, without really knowing it, I was constantly imitating the desires of everybody else around me.
So let's go back to that story, because I feel it ties in really nicely. And actually as well, just for listeners, you use a great kind of little diagram in the book in terms of talking about the way that we see, the way that our desires are formed through models. So the fallacy is that we think it's a straight line from basically us to the thing that we want, whereas actually there's a model that gets filtered through, whether that's a person or a thing. Tying that into Silicon Valley startup culture, right? I mean, that is a very, very strong culture, which, as you mentioned, has a set of forces that are pushing people to raise as much money as fast as possible so they can scale as fast as possible so they can be as valuable as possible. You were, to a degree, wrapped up in the whirlwinds of that, right? And built a very profitable, successful company, which was going to be acquired by Zappos. Talk to me about, that sort of story that you introduce in the beginning of the book, and kind of what went down and how it sort of forced you to take a little bit of a step back.
Yeah, that was in fact the third company that I'd started. So I had a whirlwind 5 or 6 years there in the startup world. So yes, it's absolutely true. I mean, these forces are extremely strong in Silicon Valley. It's not just these forces to start certain kinds of companies and to have a certain kind of lifestyle. And it's funny, like a lot of the entrepreneurs even start looking the same way, dressing the same way, talking the same way, writing their emails the same way, like never using capital letters. Like it's funny. Like I started to see this going on, and like how quickly people's entire lives change, from the way they talk to the way they dress to the kinds of music they listen to. It's like really crazy. And I'm like, what does this have to do with business? So I'm like, clearly there's something going on here. And so this is a really important point, I think. So these mimetic forces kind of cause one to desire this like certain, way of life, quality of being, this ideal that probably doesn't exist. Or at least would make you miserable trying to attain it. So I was down that path completely. And in the story that I tell in the book, I'd met Tony Hsieh, who's the former CEOs of Zappos. Fortunately, he passed away last year. And the two of us became very good friends. And he'd built a thriving, multi-billion-dollar company at the time. And my company was headquartered just down the street from Zappos. And Zappos was lauded for their company culture. Everybody that came to Vegas was getting a tour of the Zappos headquarters, from Kanye West to Serena Williams. It was like the hottest ticket in town for a couple of years. So I was heavily influenced by this. I was hanging out a lot with Tony and with the inner circle, the executive team of Zappos. Here I am building my own e-commerce company. That's an important point. My company was we didn't sell shoes, but it was in the same industry. So I'm looking at Zappos. I'm like, well, I'm struggling to hit 10 million in sales here. We're growing extremely fast, but like maybe I can adopt some of these things that people seem to love so much about Zappos. Their company culture, right? The way that their office is decorated and all of these fun, quirky, parties that they have. Like maybe this is the reason for their success, right? Like, in fact, it probably had very little to do with that. The superficial external things, right? I'm not saying that culture is not important. I'm saying that I was misreading what the real drivers of their success were. Not necessarily what they would say they were, or what the media would say. There's a certain narrative that's painted, and you have to get underneath that. So I started imitating all of these external features. From Tony personally, and then things that I saw in the company. And we got to a point where we had seriously talked about a joining forces, an acquisition. And to make a long story short, the deal fell through in a relatively dramatic fashion. Like we thought it was done, and then it was right in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis. Peak anxiety. An investment bank had just failed, and investors were very nervous. And basically, the deal fell through at the very last minute after we'd already celebrated. And I tell the story in the book about this sense of relief that I felt, because I knew that I would like my company that I had started, that I was the founder of, like everyone's dream. I had financial freedom. I had the freedom to set my own schedule, you would think, but I was just miserable, and I just kept chasing and imitating through mimetic desire things around me. And in this case, Zappos was my model. And I don't know if I would have been able to detach myself from that on my own. And it had sort of caused me to like lose my way and forget some of the things that were important to me about starting my own company in the first place. I just kind of lost sight of them in my desire to achieve this, to have the acquisition go through, and then, I don't know, to become this great philanthropist and, start my own venture capital firm or whatever, right? And that deal falling through just caused me to have to reevaluate and examine what was going on. And the relief that I felt was a relief of getting off a treadmill. And this is not the hedonic treadmill. There's some analogous treadmill to the hedonic treadmill that's like or the consumerism treadmill. And that was the treadmill for me of mimetic desire. Like, well, where does this really end? Am I just going to constantly be finding a new model of entrepreneurship, every time I start or sell a company? And where does that end? And is that going to cause me to lose myself in the process?
And as you was kind of forced to reflect on that process after the sale went south, did you get back in touch with the reason why you wanted to start a company in the first place? And like, what was that? What was the reason that you wanted to start a company in the first place?
I wanted to start a company to do something good, truly long-term good and sustainable in the world, to create jobs, to develop like deep, nourishing relationships with people. Business to me is about relationships. I did want some freedom to be able to craft a certain kind of a lifestyle. I wouldn't have been able to articulate it quite this way at the time, but I really wanted to create something that was just good and nourishing and kind of a healthy human ecology, something that made people better. And I got into we started this e-commerce company, and very quickly, because we found out like what helped us grow quickly, and it was just adding new products to the store. And to give you an example, we were just adding so many SKUs, so many products to the store that, we were selling things that I don't even believe in, like things that I don't even know are healthy. And, it's just an easy path to generating revenue. And, this continued for a couple of years. And, at a certain point, I had like forgot about the things that were important to me at the beginning. And I'm like, I don't even know if I really like this company that I started at this point, right? I feel like I've pivoted. The problem with the kind of the lean startup mentality is like if you only pivot to satisfy the needs of the market. So like, for instance, my customers were saying like, they wanted like highly questionable dietary supplements, things that are today banned and I think are pretty unhealthy. So if your driving force is just to satisfy that demand, then if you're not careful, you can end up doing things that you're not proud of, right? Or things that run against your value system. And there's not a lot of intentionality in that. So, and that happens very quickly. And that's what we did. And, I didn't know it was making me absolutely miserable, combined with the mimetic desire and this yearning to kind of, be more like Zappos was and to have that kind of a recognition. And again, so this little hiccup, this deal going south, made me take inventory of what was going on with the company. And I saw quite clearly, it didn't take me long to realize, to diagnose the problem and realize that I just, I'd forgotten why I started the company in the first place.
You make a distinction in the book between Celebristan and Freshmanistan. So Celebristan is basically this external models of desire where we are taking models of people who are far away from us, outside of our social circle. So that's like the celebrities that we're seeing on social media or whatever, right? They're sort of the people who are so far removed from our lives that it's much easier for us to just filter through that model and imitate the behavior. And then Freshmanistan is basically the people around us. So this is the whole kind of keeping up with the Joneses vibe where the neighbor's got this kind of a car, so I want to get that car too, basically. But there's more friction to that imitation because it can be directly observed. Going back to the sort of, I want to come back to the Zappos thing in an instance, because in a moment, just because you, I imagine, would have aspired to that culture and then suddenly you became part of it. So your external model became an internal model. But before we get to that, what are some tips or thoughts about how we can inoculate ourselves to a degree from the Celebristan type challenges that we have? Because we're surrounded, like our culture is a culture of celebrity. We're surrounded by it all the time. What should, and as you kind of rightly point out in the book, if you think that you're not vulnerable to being influenced by that, it suggests that you're even more vulnerable, right? So how do you think about that? How do you think about the influence that public figures on media influence you, and what things do you try and do differently to perhaps reduce those desires sort of being mimetically imitated in your own life?
Yeah, my favorite feedback on the book is when people say, "Yeah, this isn't for me. This applies to everybody else, but not to me." I'm just going to start tweeting them out every time I see those. I try so hard to make the point in the book that that's the first reaction often. Well, there's an important point to be made here, that when I say Celebristan in the book, I simply mean models that are outside of our immediate world. I don't mean celebrity, right? So in a certain case, an older brother, if there's a 6-year difference, is in a way in Celebristan to the younger brother. There's no possibility of competing, right? Usually. In the same sports for the same, girls or whatever. So, I just want to be clear. So Celebristan doesn't mean the Kardashians. They're in Celebristan for almost all of us. Yet Celebristan really just means models that are outside of our world. So there are some Celebristan models that are good and should be imitated. I use the example in the book about people that are deceased, great leaders. Martin Luther King, he's in Celebristan for all of us. He's somebody that can be, he's a model that can be imitated without coming into contact with him. So there's a lot of models like this that are positive ones. We typically call them role models for children. Unfortunately, many adults kind of think that role models only apply when you're a kid, and they sort of lose the importance of role models. But one of the points of the book is that we all have models, but they positive and negative, and it's important to understand who they are. And it's easier to usually name the Celebristan models than the Freshmanistan models, because these are people that are close to us, and we don't think of them as shaping our desires, mediating our desires to us, filtering how we see things, how we see the value of objects. I just think it's really important to sort of go back to the source. I don't think you can fully inoculate yourself to mimetic desire, but I think it's possible to become more aware, to ask yourself, to go back to the origin. It's like I've gotten into, cryptocurrency like very strongly over the last couple of years, and I would be kidding myself, right? This is what Girard calls the romantic lie, that idea that there's a direct line between me and the things that I want. I would be kidding myself if I woke up, one day a couple of years ago and, sat in front of my computer and, analyzed the markets and decided that Bitcoin was the best play, or ETH. That's just not the way that it worked, right? I mean, I started hearing all of my friends talking about their gains and investments and how this is going to change the world and all of these things. And that was kind of the first thing that moved me to be interested or desire to learn more in the first place. So, that's kind of a silly example. I think it's a very relevant one right now, considering the markets. And that's true of my own life. But being aware of that, and then kind of like narrowing down into it, well, who is it and in what ways have they influenced me? It's just one way to gain a little bit more agency and control. And I mean, this applies to everything from career decisions to, obviously to investment decisions, to dating and romance. Trying to be able to just separate a little bit the social factors involved from sort of everything is kind of very social, but at least being able to recognize how that is shaping the way that we value and pursue various things.
So circling back to the kind of transition from Celebristan to Freshmanistan and zeroing in on like the example, presumably having built companies before, you were aspiring to, I want to be like those guys, I want to be around those guys. Were you consciously getting into the mindset of, it's that thing that gets thrown around, right? But obviously, as you point out in the book, it does have value. You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time, right? Because the way to get what you want is to spend a lot of time around other people who also want the thing that you want, and then you're almost kind of mimetically imitating each other and getting to that getting closer and closer and closer to that direction. So what was that transition like for you? What was your experience of it? And looking back at it, do you see that you completely immersed yourself in that world to a point that you weren't able to step aside from it? Or were you still being conscious of the fact of like, okay, like, I'm trying to do this, but there's, there are sort of parts of my life that are not completely driven by this. How do you reflect on that? Yeah, the move to the external to the internal, if that's a correct characterization of your experience. I don't know if it is.
It is. And you rightly pointed out that in my case, some people that were in Celebristan for me came into my world. Even Tony himself, in a way. In a way he didn't, because he had hundreds of millions of dollars and I didn't. So there was some economic distance between us, but there was not social distance between us. We were in the same, we hung out in the same circles in many respects. So there was this weird dynamic of somebody sort of coming into my world that sort of changed the way that my desires were being affected. And in a way affected them much more strongly, because he was in my world. We're an average of the 5 people closest to us. That is, there's something to that. At the same time, I think we have to be very careful. I saw somebody very recently just made a comment about how we have to constantly be upgrading our friends and hanging out with more interesting people, more successful people. And I think that is the wrong approach to take to this. That would be the wrong takeaway from this. Like, it's important to have good models in our lives, but it doesn't mean that we should be constantly upgrading our friends or something like that. That's not the definition of a friend. So I'll give you an example from my own life where I started to realize what was going on. I started to realize that I desired something as an entrepreneur that I couldn't find a model for among other entrepreneurs. So, these are sort of like human characteristics, family life, some virtues, qualities that I looked for, that I really admired in people that I was meeting, some of the friends that I was meeting in Vegas. And that was a cue for me that, like, I'm really admiring some of the things that these people have that I'm not finding in my peers that are really immersed in the startup world. That was the first cue for me that I needed to perhaps like look outside of the Freshmanistan that I was in and that I wasn't going to find what I was looking for in that unless I, in a sense, transcended the boundaries of the startup world and the business world, even in general. Some of these people had nothing to do with business, and that was an important realization. So sometimes when you realize who you admire in a positive way, right? You have to check your motivations. I mean, sometimes you want to be like somebody for bad reasons. Sometimes you want to be like somebody for really good reasons, right? Because they have this beautiful, attribute, something you aspire to. And I think when you realize that, you need to pay attention to that. Because when it's in the positive sense, and you normally know when it is it coming from a place of pride, or is it coming from, a place of humility and genuine, I want to be a better person, right? And it was the I want to be a better person kind of models, those people that I admired, I just paid attention. I was like, interesting. These are people that are doing different things. I wonder what that means for me. Maybe I need to kind of expand my vision and look outside of this world. And it doesn't mean that I can't run my company. It just means that maybe I need to expand the universe of who I'm drawing inspiration from.
One of the ideas that again, like simple after the fact, but when you spend time sitting with it, it's pretty profound, is what causes conflict, right? And if you kind of ask most people think about it off the bat, conflict comes when people have differences, right? But as you sort of correctly point out in the book, a lot of conflict happens when you are in the same environment as someone. So they're in that Freshmanistan environment and you want the same things, or you are similar. Hence why, and then it was great to kind of get this explanation of an experience I've had. You imitate a friend and they might feel uncomfortable, or a friend imitates you and it feels kind of weird. And it's like, what's going on there? How should people be thinking about that? How should people be thinking about that as a sort of a model that actually applies in lots of different areas of life, be it in friendship group, be it in sort of similar areas of activity, be it in work or career? How should people be thinking about that problem of similarity breeds conflict if not managed properly?
Yeah, there's that old saying, similarity breeds contempt. And to use Freud's phrase, the narcissism of small differences. We tend to notice the small things with the people that are closest to us and have more in common with us. It's why, a married couple, like the smallest little thing can set one of them off. But this is a very Girardian, this is mimesis. We tend to be uncomfortable when people are very similar to us, and we notice things that we don't notice when there's more distance. So yes, we can think about this in a lot of different ways. I read somewhere that people that go to like in high kind of like for award ceremonies and stuff like that, where you have the movie stars and musicians going to them, they can basically like dress down like two levels in terms of like class, in other words, like they could wear like sweatpants and sneakers, but not like one level, because it would create like, I don't know, there's a lot of like weird games that we play where like some things are acceptable, but not if they kind of imitate somebody else a little bit too closely, right? We can think about like a company, right? And how somebody is totally non-threatening to you while they work in a different division of the company, or they're taking a totally different path. But as soon as you start working on the same project and competing for recognition on the same project or in the same division, the person, can start to appear as a threat, whereas before they weren't at all. And this has to do with proximity, and you're sort of now in a type of Freshmanistan. I had I just made a new author friend who wrote a fiction book that's full of mimesis and mimetic desire, though she didn't really know it. So I read this book and reached out, and I was like, this book is totally about mimetic desire. And, she kind of laughed, and she was like, well, this is a perfect situation because our books are totally non-competitive. Mine's fiction, yours nonfiction. Like, this is great, right? And like drawing on the ideas from the book. So that, we often don't think about that. And we kind of ascribe, maybe the reason why we don't like somebody or why we're threatened by somebody to like some kind of, traits or characteristics of theirs that we don't like. But more often than not, it's this sort of mimetic threat that they pose to us. It's like everybody's kind of saying, imitate me, but not too much. Like everybody likes to be imitated because it's flattering to be imitated. But at the same time, if somebody sort of moves into your space and starts competing for your, I don't know, in the same space as your book or your podcast or your company or something like that, then it's like, well, it was nice while you were sort of at a distance, but like now you're a little too close, right? And this is one of the points, and Girard says this is the paradox of conflict, that we typically think it's due to our differences, but in fact it's due to our sameness. It's due to us at the same level, at some level, wanting the same things, right? In the case of politics, this could be power. So if you go to the root of most conflicts, Girard would say any conflict, you will find somewhere deep down two people or two groups that want the same thing. And if they didn't, it's hard to understand like why they would care about one another at all.
There was a really interesting reference you made on that note in the book that I think it was sort of, was it the guys who did the 9/11 bombings, right? Where you were basically kind of insinuating that, if they wanted to cause that level of damage to a society, that probably suggested not that they completely fully rejected the society. That might have been consciously what they thought, but then on some level, they actively wanted the things that society provided, or some of the elements of that society that they demonized. And that was sort of a force that was acting. And I think that ties really nicely into this kind of idea of scapegoating, which you talk about in the book quite extensively, right? Which I find fascinating. So you talk about these loops that we get into, could be in an organization, could be broader picture in a society, where we get into these sort of mimetic conflicts, or we get into these almost tit for tat type exchanges, right? And then at some point, in order to resolve the chaos, somebody has to be made responsible for that. In an organization, that might be the "you're fired" moment. In a society, at the moment, it might be somebody gets cancelled. How, and on that note, on the cancellation note, we're really struggling as a society with these problems at the moment, right? Like, in terms of the sort of the nature of debate and the polarization in politics in so many different areas. It's a very broad question, so take it however you want. But how do we think about breaking out of these cycles of sort of scapegoating and not really dealing with the root issues of the problem, which, at least to an extent, from the analysis that you've done in the book, is linked to this concept of mimesis, right? Like, it keeps repeating again and again and again.
Yeah, the reason, the line about the 9/11 hijackers, that comes from Girard in his last book called Battling to the End. And it's the very last book he wrote. It's a very apocalyptic book. And he's saying, like, listen, if we don't realize that mimetic desire and mimetic rivalry is sort of the force generating this violence, we'll always misdiagnose the problem. It's this us versus them mentality. And he noted a fact about the hijackers that everybody else had missed, that I think I mentioned in the book. And he just noted that in the days leading up to the attacks, they were bar hopping in South Florida and binge playing video games and doing all of these things that, that are associated with American consumer culture. Right? While at the same time, sort of like externally totally rejecting it. So like, what was going on there, right? It's this idea that we kind of have like a love-hate relationship with our enemies. It's like, sometimes I think like this is why like people just can't stop talking about Trump, right? Like at some level, like, what's going on there? It's not normal. He's gone, right? But it's still happening. So this gets to the problem. I think Girard is saying that we misdiagnose the root of our conflict, and we don't recognize what's going on in ourselves to drive this conflict. And humanity has always not done the self-examination that they need to do, and always tried to diffuse rivalry and conflict and tension onto some third party. It's just like a perennial feature, going all the way back to the rituals in the temple in Jerusalem, where they would quite literally symbolically transfer the sins of the people onto a goat and then expel the goat out into the desert to die. And Girard says, look, as a society, we just continue to find new ways to do this. We may not literally be sacrificing and killing people, but I mean, we do that too. Often it happens in subtler ways. We see this with cancel culture, in the political rhetoric right now. There always has to be a scapegoat. It's almost like the news can't function if there's not a scapegoat. It's like practically runs on them. And the scapegoat is really just a function of our false belief that we're actually, like, something is actually being done when we see somebody punished. We see somebody paying the price for our faults and failings. It gives the illusion that something has been done about the problem. It provides a sense of catharsis for the group. It's like, okay, there's the cause of the problem, and which feels good, and it just delays and actually makes all of the problems worse. There was in coming to a recognition that we have it in us, that it's actually sort of a key feature of humanity, that we tend to transfer blame to other people through the scapegoat mechanism. Coming to grips with that and realizing that is really the only way forward, I think. There was a really, really surprising piece in the USA Today a couple of years ago, written by a journalist who basically said, look, I've realized that I've been scapegoating other people in all of these ways over the last few years, and I want to publicly apologize, and literally referenced the scapegoat mechanism and just said, look, I need to be better at that, right? And hopefully this is a model for other people. And I read it and I was so shocked by it, because I mean, you never ever see anything like that. So I tracked the journalist down, and we had coffee here in DC. I'm like, have you heard of René Girard? He's like, no, but I learned about the scapegoat mechanism, and I realized that I'm actually responsible for this. Like, I'm part of it. It's not just something that other people do. Like, if I just talk about cancel culture and don't realize that I might not do it on Twitter, I might not do it online, but I probably have my own ways of doing it in my workplace or in my family or with friends or what, so that's the danger. And it's a knee-jerk thing. And it just always comes back to, what role have I played in transferring blame onto other people and not dealing with things myself?
Yeah, and then if you're able to do that, you can sort of, to a degree, you can transcend that cycle. And one of the things that you mentioned in the book that I was like, yes, that makes a lot of sense, is how profound the story of the crucifixion is in the context of the narrative of humanity, right? Because as you're sort of saying in the book, up to that point, we didn't really have a story where somebody who was reading it was able to empathize both with the crowd mobbing the scapegoat and with the scapegoat, right? Can you just speak a little bit to the significance of that? Because that was a part of the book where I thought that is a powerful, powerful, powerful model. And it's incredible that didn't exist. And we need more stories like that, right? Like, we need more stories like that in the current environment of being able to see both sides of the picture, whatever they look like. They might not be in a religious context. But yeah, I would just love to hear you riff on that, because it really struck me as an important point.
Yeah, Girard says that the crucifixion and the Gospels are kind of the anti-myth. That's like the myth to end myths, in the sense that, before, this scapegoat mechanism had been employed, and some victim would be sacrificed, but there would always be the perception that some evil was extinguished, or they paid some price for whatever they did. And if you look at all of the myths, right, it's always told from the perspective, for obvious reasons, right, because the victim is gone, right. It's always told from the perspective of the scapegoaters. So you're never getting the true story. So, a large part of Girard's work, we won't be able to get into all of it now, but, was analyzing myths. And he's saying behind every myth, there's some violence that was done. And in the myth, if you dig deep, what you'll realize is that myths are just humanity's way of telling a story to cover up their own violence. So what we see in the story of the crucifixion is it didn't work the way that it's supposed to work, right? Like you have this clearly innocent victim who has been sacrificed and obviously willingly went to his death, and then you have this small circle of people who all of a sudden start telling the wrong narrative, right? Like this is innocent, and people can clearly see that. And then there's this odd thing that doesn't seem to be happening today, is like when people, would read the story, hear about the story, or read the Gospels, there is this sense of, I mean, if you read them reflectively, you realized, and the whole point is that I'm perfectly capable of having done this thing. If I lived in that place and at that time, chances are I would have definitely crucified Christ, right? And you start to see yourself caught up in that mimetic process. And, Peter himself in the Gospels was, somebody who's very close. Even he got caught up, right? And with that denial. And it wasn't he eventually caught himself, right? Which is a beautiful kind of parable for, we can find ourselves getting pulled into the mob. And we have a chance to catch ourselves, right? To see that that's happening. And so yes, we read it, we see that we're part of the accusers, and we also at the same time see that the victim is clearly innocent. And that should cause incredible tension, to anybody reading those stories, and that's why it's so important. And I just think like that's something I don't see happening a lot, today, where there's that level of reflection where we can identify with the crowd, but also sort of realize that the crowd tends to distort the reality. And in the Gospels kind of give us a mirror to this perennial process of scapegoating, where we see that the scapegoat was in fact innocent, and that there's this, and it revealed this problem, right? This way that we have of dealing with our issues, the way that the Romans tried to quell a problem by crucifying Christ.
You've done quite a lot of work on education of desire and sort of introducing some of these ideas to different age groups, which I find kind of fascinating. You also make a point in the book that good teachers, or all of us really to an extent, have a responsibility to help people want the right thing. And that struck me as a really, really important point. I'd love to hear a little bit about, what are some of these initiatives that you've been involved in? What do they look like? And, what does it mean to help somebody want the right things? Obviously, living in a culture where there's a lot of relativism, there's a great deal of emphasis on subjectivity, and, what's right to you might not be right to me, and so on. So, yeah, two-part question. We'd love to hear a little bit about education of desire stuff. And then, what's wanting the right things? How can there be an objective hierarchy of values? Or how can you at least communicate that idea to somebody in a way that they can latch onto and understand?
Yeah. I hold up the model of Maria Montessori in the book, which I think was the last real revolution in education. It happened a very long time ago. In that educating desire and forming the desire in the child to learn was a central part of her educational philosophy. And one of the things I tried to communicate, which I think is important, is that she modeled a desire for learning, but then removed herself as the mediator or the obstacle. So why is that important? It's important in that the freedom of the child, the freedom of the student, is respected greatly. So forming or educating the desire of a child, for instance, as every parent has a responsibility to do. Every parent does, whether they know it or not, right? This is a matter of intentionality. Is important. But there comes a point where, if something is forced, right? If a child is like forced to want something, that doesn't work either, because, nobody, there has to be freedom involved, right? It's kind of like love. You can't force me to love anybody, right? And if I do, it's not love, right? It needs to be something freely chosen. So there's a way to model the desire for certain goods, certain human goods. And I think, we're safe, and for the most part, when we look at some of the perennial, human goods. I mean, perennial virtues, things that have never gone out of fashion or gained like mimetic, currency the way that ideas do. I mean, ideas are like fashion trends sometimes. Some ideas come in and out of style, but there are some ideas about what it means to live a good life that go all the way back to classic philosophy, that have never gone well. Those can go out of style too, but we can at least look to them as like foundational bedrocks, right? Like the four cardinal virtues, for instance, and modeling, like starting there, like focusing on first principles, and that is one thing we can model a desire for. While also like leaving the student free to to not feeling forced. So one of the things that we do. So I co-teach a class at the university, and because the models of desire are sort of so important, one of the things that we do is we bring in a lot of people, to people that I consider the kinds of people that model really, really positive behaviors, right? Virtuous people, and provide them as models to the students, because in a way, they are more powerful than any kind of information that I could ever tell them, right? Like it's because this comes down to models. Models are extremely popular. I think we need more models in education. I think like one of the initiatives I'm involved with is more mentorship in education. I actually don't see why every high school student in the country shouldn't have an older mentor. I think we can begin finding ways to pair people up with mentors, with people that can help them. It's really important. So there's the interpersonal role I think needs to be emphasized. We're emphasizing information and standardized testing and all of these things, and we're losing the really important sort of interpersonal role that the models of desire have, right? Like our teachers are really, really important. I mean, many people can go back and point to a teacher as the reason why they took a certain course of study, why they went into a certain job, yet we seem to be de-emphasizing the role of the teacher. Putting more resources into technology. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I think it's great for scaling. I think it has a lot of advantages. But we seem to be de-emphasizing the human aspect of it. At the very time, I think that's the one thing that will kind of save education, and keep it from becoming just kind of like search for data, right? Like knowledge transfer.
Yeah, and on that note of models, I'd just be really curious to know, are there any people that come to mind for you, people who have made you want the right things, people who you see have been kind of crucial in your formation of models for your desires and what you want, and creating a hierarchy of values in your own life? Anybody that comes to mind in particular?
I have many people that come to mind, but they're not public persons, right? So it probably won't mean a whole lot for me to tell you who they are. One of the early models for me as an entrepreneur was an attorney that I got to know really well, who was an incredibly kind and honest, and had a wonderful family life, and affected me very, very deeply. To this day, we're still very good friends, and just kind of like shifted my priorities and made me think about the way that I spend my time. Because formerly I had this kind of like negative ideas of attorneys, right? Of all the ones that I work with, he totally like blew up my idea of what they meant. In terms of and I have many. And today, my model, for being an author, I have some, like Walker Percy is a model for me. He wrote a great book called Lost in the Cosmos, The Moviegoer. These kind of people that are able to, kind of transcend political divides, that are able to speak to everybody in different ways, that are able to kind of get at like just deep human truths, anthropological truths, right? And just kind of like cut through a lot of the bullshit happening on the surface. So somebody like him is a model for me. I mean, stylistically, but more important than stylistically, in terms of like the project that he was trying to undertake, right? And I think that's a very healthy model to adopt. And I have many, and I find that the kind of I have a composite kind of like I've drawn inspiration from many different places, from authors, from just people I know in my life that are kind of hidden models of desire, to have formed a kind of person that I'm working on becoming that will be different than any of them, but will have sort of, drawn different pieces from all of them. And that's a really beautiful thing.
You spoke a bit before about education and sort of the obsession with tech and scaling, and couldn't agree more with you about the importance of the human factor. How do you think about the difference between a virtual role model, so perhaps somebody whose podcast you listen to every week, versus a real teacher in your life? Do you see a great distinction there? If so, what's going on? Obviously, there are lots of intangibles, right? It's hard to put your finger on to an extent. But how do you think about that? The in-person versus the teacher that you know in person versus perhaps the virtual mentor that you've never met and might never meet?
I think there's no substitute for the in-person, for the personal attention, for the personal interaction. I certainly, have people that I respect greatly, and I learn a lot from podcasts and from virtual mentors or models. But there's just no substitute from a person who knows me. So there's the interpersonal knowledge, because when there's interpersonal knowledge, and this is why it's so important in the educational sphere, you treat the person as totally unique, right? And like if one of my students comes to me and says, Professor Burgess, I'm trying to figure out what path to take here, what kind of internship to get, what kind of job to get. If I don't know that student at all, it's really hard for me. I'd have to give him some kind of here's some basic rules of thumb to follow. So I always say, why don't we let's meet up for coffee a few times over the next month. We spend a few hours together. I get to know him. It changes dramatically the kind of guidance and insight that I can provide. I can help that person ask the right questions. I know a little bit more about him and the family. There's just no substitute for that. So I would say that, it's something that as we move into more and more of a virtual world in education, I would encourage people to make an intentional effort to develop relationships. And by the way, maybe that is with, somebody who's virtual for you now, that you can reach out to and develop a personal relationship with. Like, my students are always shocked when I tell them that, a lot of people I know, they don't realize that the only reason that I know them is because I just reached out to them and sent them a cold email, and we became friends. How I knew Tony Hsieh, to be honest. And we became good friends. What's the worst that can happen? They say no. They say that they're too busy. Get used to it, right? So, you don't know if you don't ask. And I encourage my students to always make that effort to try to develop a relationship.
For sure. I think that's a brilliant note to end on, Luke. This was a great conversation. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Please direct listeners to wherever you want them to head. So the book is Wanting, your website, Twitter, wherever you want them to go.
Yeah, the book should be available anywhere you like to buy books. And I publish a Substack called Anti-Memetic, which you can find on my website, lukeburgess.com. So, this is a big topic, and I try to unpack a little bit more of it each week. I plan on spending, the next couple of years doing that and trying to connect this to current events, to things happening as well as I can. So if you're interested in following the story of how memetic desire is influencing, the world, please give it a follow.
Awesome. We'll link to all that in the show notes. Luke, thanks again. This was great.
Thanks so much.
Once again, thank you for tuning in to the MetaLearn podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to take your learning to the next level, go to the homepage of my site, metalearn.net, and sign up for my free 5-step video course that will teach you the fundamental principles needed to learn anything fast, backed by cutting-edge research in cognitive science. You can access all of the show notes from today's episode on the podcast section of my site, metalearn.net, and don't forget to join me again next week for another in-depth interview with a thought leader. Until then, keep learning and catch you next time.